principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government and government officials responsible to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. It is our obligation to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. Today, today we meet to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs, an organization whose essential duty is second only to the men and women who they serve, and their obligation and their duty and their service to protect our country. If, in fact, we abandon our veterans, then we abandon our men and women in harm's way. We cannot and should not ever forget that service begins by raising one's right hand, but continues for a lifetime, and the effects of that service often has a lingering effect on the men and women who in a voluntary army go in harm's way because they respect and love their country. Congress, in fact, exempted the Department of Veterans Affairs from sequestration. So important is the obligation to get it right that money has not been a problem. Furthermore, even as we began opening the government again after the latest effects, additional dollars were dedicated to a backlog that is by definition inexcusable for those who have served our country. The Department, which is a second only to the Department of Defense, spent an estimated $6.1 million on what was marked or considered to be training conferences. Today, we are here at a time in which many people would say, didn't you already cover the GSA scandal? Didn't you already cover the IRS scandal of wasting people's money on conferences? It's true we did. It's true that these conferences are, in fact, historical, not current. But there are several reasons we are here today, not just that these were lavish parties that the Department spent, but that the IG's own report finds it impossible, due to the hopeless accounting at Veterans Administration, to find out exactly how much was spent. A forensic audit only estimates how much was spent. This is a lot of walking around money that has been left loose at the Veterans Administration that could have and should have been made available to our veterans and their needs. Additionally, we can find no purpose for these conferences that justifies it. I do not often reflect on confidential conversations I have, but there is one that I have made public in the past and I will continue to. General Shinseki, in a conversation with me at the beginning of the discovery of this scandal, told me his greatest obligation and his problem was to change the culture at the VA, a culture he inherited, a culture that in fact talks about the veterans and then in fact fails to perform in a number of areas. The taxpayers in this case got a lousy deal. It isn't just that there were lavish conferences and, once again, videos and mocking of people's real obligations and seriousness, but in this case, they had an opportunity and an obligation to train HR people, to be part of that culture of change that the Secretary so much said he wanted to get accomplished on his watch, and they failed to do so. The Office of Inspector General, in attempting to conduct an audit by recreating the budget using the few records that were available, the IG found at least $762,000 of unnecessary and unauthorized wasteful expense. How could this happen? There could be $750,000 of waste. How could it happen? It could happen because, in fact, this agency has deep pockets and money that is designed to have flexibility because we want that flexibility to be used for our veterans. Department senior leadership effectively gave the conference planners a blank check, and those planners took advantage of it. I, in fact, am not pleased with outside conference planners. But let's understand, $450,000 to market and hype the conference was a decision that really didn't need to be made, because the fact is these are employees. You're paying for them to come. You can order them to come. You can encourage them to come. Or you can, in fact, make it clear that if they don't come, it can reflect on their continued training requirement. So why do you need to advertise? These aren't buyers. These are, in fact, recipients of a training that they need and perhaps a bit of a perk to get away from the day-to-day job. $50,000 was spent on a movie excuse me, or what we might call a YouTube phenomenon on Patton. $98,000 was spent promoting on promotional products such as notebooks, water bottle, hand sanitizers, fitness walking kits, and the like. Again, I'm not sure what part of the HR training that reflected. When planners asked their managers about the budget, the managers replied, and I quote, "Don't worry about it, because the Veterans Administration, Veterans Affairs, is a large agency with deep pockets." Yes, it's a large agency with deep pockets, but those pockets were not intended to be picked by either contractors that were likely unnecessary or, in fact, people who we held accountable and paid to be accountable to the taxpayers. It shouldn't come as a surprise, then, that the conference planners spent considerably more time on planning and entertainment activities for themselves than they did for planning the training activities. Conference planners visited Dallas, Nashville, and Orlando to scout possible locations for conferences. In emails, they raved about what a great time they were having on what amounted to be taxpayers' finance vacations. While they were on these paid vacations, they accepted improper gifts from hotels competing for the host of the conference, including spa packages and room upgrades to show tickets, limo rides, and helicopter rides. To make matters worse, during these conferences, when they were so busy getting the perks of representing a large, deep-pocket buyer, they, in fact, asked for and received overtime pay. Only, that's right, Ms. Maloney, only in this kind of environment of not caring enough about the taxpayers' money can you have somebody have what I grew up calling chutzpah, to use taxpayers' money, enjoy the perks, and then say, but I need overtime. The conference planners thought they deserved recognition for their hard work and their efforts to save, quote, department money, and amazingly, they did get recognized. Without doing any due diligence, the Department awarded over $43,000 in cash and one-time awards to conference planners for a job well done. This is a pattern that we see, that bonuses are an entitlement, they're automatic. But in this case, to see that bonuses were basically there for providing perks to the very people granting it is the kind of quid pro quo that we need to get out of government. And if we can't get it out of government using techniques such as training and responsibility and real belief in what you do for the government, then in fact, undoubtedly, Congress will again pass additional laws that will be complained about as restraining management. But in fact, if liberty is given to management to do the job right and they abuse it, they can expect nothing else. Meanwhile, with the Department having over 300,000 employees, a $140 billion budget that was immune to sequestration, our veterans were abused. And I use that word carefully, but I use it deliberatively. The number of pending veteran benefits claim currently stand at 700,000. One of the great abuses discovered in preparation for this hearing is that the stated number is 400,000. Why? Because first we have to delay and not do really anything for the first 120 or 125 days, and then we put them on the list. So whether you say it's 700,000 waiting or 400,000 that are clearly being abused by a backlog that, no matter how much money is thrown at it, never seems to shrink. The Department continues to fall short of its goals, and as additional money occurs, they simply have excuses. In fact, the Veterans Administration missed its own target for processing claims by approximately 100,000 last year. The number of appeal claims has continued to rapidly grow to over 255,000. Other committees have held hearings on the effects of those appeals claims, the inaccuracy, and the likelihood that appeal claims, if occurred often enough, will be meritorious. The Department's waste and its problems are primarily the Committee on Veteran Affairs' responsibility. However, with the good work of the IG and the effects that we see of an IG doing the right thing and not being able to get to the right answer, or, in this case, 26 out of 49 IG recommendations remain unfulfilled. This committee has very little choice but to bring up this issue and make it very clear that we will not take our eyes off of Veterans Administration for any of their practices until there is a belief there has been meaningful change in the culture, as the Secretary has told us, in the culture that he inherited. And with that, I will put the rest of my opening statement in the record. I thank the Ranking Member for his indulgence, and I yield.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking Mr. Griffin and Deputy Inspector General at the Department of Veterans Affairs for the work he and others at his office conducted with respect to two conferences hosted by the VA several years ago in Orlando, Florida. The report you issued, Inspector, was comprehensive in identifying the problems at the VA, and it made concrete recommendations to remedy those problems. You did great work, and I want to make sure that you take back our thanks to all of those who work in your office and contributed to this report. Last November, the House Committee on Veterans Affairs held a hearing on these issues and reviewed the Inspector General's report in detail. The committee considered the significant problems associated with the VA's conference review process, and it examined many reforms that were being implemented to ensure adequate internal controls and oversight. For example, the VA has made significant changes in its conference planning and oversight policies. One change was to clearly define specific executives accountable for ensuring that conference planning and spending complies with regulations and policies. Another was to integrate VA budget officers into conference planning and to build in fiscal controls. The VA also prohibited conferences that cost more than $500,000 without a waiver from the Secretary, and it required approval from the Deputy Secretary for conferences that cost between $100,000 and $500,000. The VA also established a training support office to provide guidance to VA offices about the applicable regulations and other requirements, and the VA mandated additional training on travel and purchase cards. The VA also held accountable employees who were involved in the 2011 Orlando conferences. For example, the VA demoted the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Human Resources Management, removing her from the Senior Executive Service, and admonished then Chief of Staff John Gingrich for his role in authorizing the conferences. The Dean of the Veterans Affairs Learning University also resigned in response to the IG's findings, and other career employees have administrative actions still pending. VA officials also asked John Sepulveda, the Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration, to resign when the Inspector General's report found that he abdicated his responsibilities as the Assistant Secretary when he failed to provide proper guidance and oversight to his senior executives in the operations of his organization. The Inspector General's report also found that Mr. Sepulveda falsely claimed he had no knowledge about a George Patton parody video shown at the conference, although he later revised his statement. I would have preferred to hear directly from Mr. Sepulveda today about his actions, but I understand that he will assert his constitutional rights not to testify, and I will respect his right to do so. For today's hearing, I believe it is important to hear from our witnesses about steps that still need to be completed to fully implement the Inspector General's recommendations. For example, I'd like to hear about the status of a web portal the VA plans to use to help collect information about conference spending, which I understand is running later than scheduled. I'd also like an update on the status of the handbook on conference planning, execution, and oversight, which the Inspector General believes will satisfy many of the recommendations that remain open. I'd also like to hear about VA's progress in meeting benchmarks established by the Obama administration for all agencies. In November 2011, President Obama issued an Executive Order 13589, which required agencies to reduce their total expenditures on travel and other items by 20% below their 2010 spending. The next year, the Office of Management and Budget issued a memorandum directing agencies to reduce their travel budgets even more, this time by 30%, and to maintain that spending level until 2016. Finally, I want to thank our witnesses from the Department for appearing here today. I know some of you are very new to your jobs. Ms. Farisi, I understand that you have been serving in the role of Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration for only about a month. Although you were not here when these mistakes were made, the committee will look to you to complete the implementation of the Inspector General's recommendations and to prevent the waste that occurred in 2011 from being repeated. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the Ranking Member, and I might note that Mr. Murray has been, as far as we can tell, in his position since 2005. So perhaps the long-serving and the new kid on the block will be a good combination for today. All members will have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous information for the record. I now ask unanimous consent that the Oversight Committee's staff report entitled U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs 2011 Human Resources Conferences, A Culture of Mismanagement and Reckless Spending be placed in the record. Without objection, so noted, and copies will be distributed to all members so they may use the material.
Mr. Chairman, just one clarification. That's the Republicans' report, is that right?
It is. It is. If you have a minority report, I'd love to see it.
All right, but we had no input in this report. The report that you just submitted.
Did they have input?
No. It's a
staff
report for the majority.
All right, thank you.
I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses at this time and introduce the Honorable Gina Farisi. You know, Connolly, one of these days you'll be introducing, and I look forward to seeing you make similar mistakes at times. If it happens, it could happen. Mr. Edward Murray, or sorry, the Assistant Secretary of Human Resources and Administration for the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Ed Murray is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Finance at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and as we said, since 2005. The Honorable John Sepulveda is the former Assistant Secretary for Human Resources and Administration at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. The Honorable Richard Griffin is the Deputy Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and his Chief Deputy, Mr. Gary Abe, thank you, that's twice, is the Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits and Evaluations at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and I understand the chief person responsible for this work. Pursuant to the committee's rules, would you please all rise, raise your right hands to take the oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record indicate that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. When we begin, I understand that we will have Ms. Farisi and Mr. Griffin will be doing the opening statements. I understand, as the ranking member said, Mr. Sepulveda, that you may not be willing to testify. Is that correct? Okay, then we'll go through the obligatory questions with you before opening statements. So we have no intention on having anyone remain longer than appropriate. Mr. Sepulveda, would you please turn your mic on when you answer. You have not provided us with any written testimony today. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, on the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Which is the privilege not to incriminate yourself by answering. Is that correct?
It's a privilege to remain silent, sir.
Okay. It is our understanding from your counsel that you may assert that constitutional privilege, and you have. Mr. Sepulveda, today's hearing will address the planning and execution of 2 Department of Veterans Affairs conferences held in Orlando, Florida in 2011. As the Assistant Secretary of Human Resources and Administration during the period in question, you played a lead role in the conference planning process. You were uniquely qualified to assist the committee in the investigation into the waste that may have occurred at this event. Your name appears in more than 80 times in the Inspector General's report on the conferences. So I must ask you to consider answering the committee's questions, and I'm going to ask you a few right now to see if you'll answer any questions. Mr. Sepulveda, you are no longer an employee of the VA. Is that correct?
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Mr. Sepulveda, when did you resign from the VA?
Again, on the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Mr. Sepulveda, are you currently receiving full retirement benefits?
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional right.
Mr. Sepulveda, there was an article in the Federal Times on October 1, 2012 that discussed the conferences that we are here to talk about today. The article contained a statement attributed to you. The statement addressed your resignation from the Veterans Administration. The statement was, quote, "I resigned because I did not want to be a distraction to the administration, comma, Secretary Sebelius." Shinseki, and the VA, especially as they continue to work each day to address the urgent needs of our nation's veterans. Mr. Sepulveda, why did you resign from the Veterans Administration?
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional right.
Mr. Sepulveda, is that statement attributed to you, in fact, your statement?
Again, on the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Mr. Sepulveda, I'm disappointed that you're not willing to give statement, that you're willing to give a statement apparently to the Federal Times about your resignation, but you won't do so here today. Additionally, Mr. Sepulveda, when the OIG investigators asked you whether you had viewed the patent video parody before it was shown publicly, you answered no. Is that correct?
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Well, Mr. Sepulveda, I have many more questions on this list, but it appears as though you will answer no additional questions. Is there any question I can ask you today that is germane to our discovery that you are willing to answer?
On the advice of my counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based on my Fifth Amendment constitutional privilege.
Okay. In that case, I won't say you're excused. You're dismissed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're most welcome. We'll take a very short recess just so they can reset and remove his nameplate. Well, this really does look like a divide now between the IGs and the administration, but we'll leave it this way to be expeditious. We now continue with our hearing. Ms. Farisi, such time as you may consume, but if you can, stay approximately 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Issa, and you were correct.
And I will tell you, I apologize, you have to get these a little closer if we're going to hear. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Issa, and you were correct. It is Farisi. Ranking Member Cummings and distinguished members of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to discuss the Department of Veteran Affairs' commitment to transparency, oversight, and the training of its employees to deliver the highest quality service to our nation's veterans, family members, and survivors, while ensuring the accountability of taxpayer funds. I am joined today by Edward Murray, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Finance in the Office of Management. Sitting behind me are Jack Kammerer, Senior Advisor, and Ford Hurd, Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Procurement Policy, Systems and Oversight, Office of Acquisition and Logistics. I know that many of you are interested in talking about the 2011 Human Resources Training Conferences held in Orlando, the issues identified by the VA Inspector General, and about what our Department has done over the last year to ensure that such issues do not occur again. Having taken this position last month, I was not with VA last year when the VA began implementing corrective actions to further strengthen oversight over training conferences. But I and my accompanying witnesses look forward to discussing the results of the reforms and reviews VA has conducted. While the findings of the report were troubling, we also recognize the critical importance of VA training. The IG report states that VA's Human Resources Conferences in Orlando were held to fulfill valid training needs and that they offered legitimate, substantive training courses, making clear that our focus on legitimate and required training is not in question. Learning of the event's failures only makes more acute the fact that VA's mission to serve our veterans must be at the core of our work all of the time, including when we are planning, attending, and managing training conferences. VA began taking actions immediately after learning of the IG's report. In September of 2012, VA issued a revised training conference planning and oversight policy. This policy established new standards to ensure senior executives exercise due diligence in the planning, execution, and management of their sponsored training conferences. In summary, this policy demands 3 things. First, every training conference will have a point of accountability at the senior executive level. Second, each training conference will have 4 phases: concept, development, execution, and reporting, each with its own objectives, metrics, and standards of execution to ensure value and accountability. And third, a new training support office to assist VA employees in meeting our new reporting requirements. This policy ensures greater oversight over each training conference. For training conferences estimated To cost over $20,000, the policy requires the appointment of a second senior official to ensure that the training conference is executed in accordance with policy and at the cost approved by the administration or staff office. These duties carry through the training conference, as the official must certify that the training conference was executed appropriately after its completion. VA's administrations and staff offices have engaged in a reexamination of the methods that we use to train. VA is leveraging current capabilities such as video teleconferencing, our online training portal known as our talent management system, and the VA National Telecommunications System to cut costs. In FY 2012, one organization within VA alone realized $33 million in cost avoidance as a result of increased usage of these systems, an increase of 29% usage from 2011. The September 2012 policy strengthened the development of business cases that must be prepared in advance of a training conference. The sponsor must show the training conference is a part of a strategy to develop employee skill sets and then measure outcomes to help develop more relevant and focused training in the future. As a result of surveys conducted after the Orlando Training Conference, we learned that 70% of supervisors stated that their employees' job performance had improved after the training conferences. Continuous workforce training and development are absolutely critical to delivering the timely, quality VA care and services our veterans have earned and deserved. Our Department's mission and sacred obligation are to honor and best serve our veterans, their family members, and survivors. Incumbent in that mission is the non-negotiable requirement to manage our resources carefully and ensure that there is always appropriate oversight and accountability for our taxpayers' dollars. Mr. Chairman, the VA panel and I will be glad to answer questions from you and other members of the committee this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today and for your continued support of the work of the men and women of the VA Office of Inspector General. Today marks the 61st time over the past 6 years that IG managers have provided congressional testimony. During these hearings, we've covered a wide variety of challenging topics, including mental health program management, military sexual trauma, IT security and protecting veterans' private information, physician staffing standards, VBA claims processing issues, and internal controls for VA fee-basis payments. In addition to these hearings, featuring the work of our audit and healthcare staff, our investigative team in fiscal year 13 made 498 arrests, including a former VAMC director for wire fraud, bribery, and conflict of interest, a fiduciary who stole $2.35 million from 54 veterans, and a service-disabled veteran-owned small business fraud of $6 million to include a kickback of $1.2 million to a VAMC engineer. In addition, our Office of Investigations achieved $718 million in fines, penalties, restitution, and civil judgments. During FY 13, our Office of Contract Review reported monetary benefits of $678 million in potential cost savings and recoveries. Overall, monetary benefits for FY 13 was $3.6 billion, representing a return on investment of $36 for every $1 in the IG budget. Our hotline handled 27,000 contacts, generating more than 1,225 open cases. It was actually a contact with our hotline in April of 2012 that triggered our review of the Orlando training conferences. As you know, our report identified 8 issue areas as follows. Number 1, VA leadership failed to provide proper oversight. Number 2, VA employees improperly accepted gifts. Number 3, HR&A exceeded Chief of Staff authorization for the conferences. Number 4, VA inappropriately conducted pre-planning site visits. Number 5, lack of accountability and control over conference costs. Number 6, inadequate management of interagency agreement terms and cost. Number 7, contract violations and lack of oversight led to excessive costs and illegal and wasteful expenditures. And finally, number 8 is the inappropriate use of government purchase cards. To address these shortcomings, we made 49 recommendations to the VA Secretary, who agreed to take corrective actions. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Mr. Abe and I will be pleased to answer any questions the members may have.
Thank you, and I think we'll have a great many questions. My opening question, Ms. Farrisee, as I said in my opening statement, the Secretary told me many years ago that he inherited a culture that he had to change, a culture that he had not encountered in the U.S. military, and was shocked that it existed in the premier agency to take care of U.S. military after they leave active duty. In your short time, have you observed problems inherent in the attitudes at Veterans Affairs that are part of activities such as this waste, such as the seemingly impossible task of ever catching up to the backlog and the backlog's backlog?
Mr. Chairman, in my short time, I have not noticed this. What I have noticed is that people seem to understand very clearly that there have been more processes put in place, that there is a requirement for accountability in this department, and they also understand why that has happened, recognize it.
Well, let me follow up then, because you've only been on board since your confirmation in September. Mr. Murray's been on board a long time. If I told you you had to produce a handbook and you agreed to do so, and you spent millions of dollars every month without that handbook, and you came before Congress and you told us about all these things that sound like they're right out of a handbook, would you be surprised that my question to you is, why did your organization miss an agreed-on deadline to produce a handbook? And how hard can it be to produce at least a draft handbook so guidance can be available while millions of dollars are being spent every month?
Mr. Chairman, the guidance that came out in September 2012, the policy that the Secretary rushed to ensure was put out as soon as he was advised of the IG's recommendations in August of 2012, is the current policy that has been—
But where's the handbook?
The handbook is still in development, and it will—
Where's the handbook? Can you make a copy of the draft of the handbook to us so we can see how much work product has gone on? I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars being spent every month. We're talking about a kind of a maybe almost inappropriate way to reduce travel by saying we're going to cut it 20%, when in fact the right number might be 80% and is unlikely to be 20%. The question is, will you make to this committee available all draft materials related to this handbook that are in place as of today so we can understand why it's so hard? You understand, most companies produce a handbook almost immediately so as to limit litigation. And in the HR business, handbooks of conduct are routine, and yet this seems to be so vexing that Mr. Griffin has to say he doesn't and I suspect he will say he doesn't understand why it's so hard to get it out. Do you have a note there?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and it says the handbook was made a part of our response.
Handbook draft.
Draft.
Okay, and
Draft.
that's current as of today.
As of today. And it will not be complete until our goal is December.
December. Well, it's a lofty goal. Mr. Griffin, you made the IG overall. You made 49 or so requests. Some of the most important ones, 20-some, 26 or so, are unkept today. Can you find a valid reason that this could not be greater implementation, or at least partial implementation, as of today?
I can't speak to the level of effort that has been brought to bear against the 49 items. I can't say that in the area of the personnel actions that we thought were in order, all but 2 of the people that we felt should have some personnel action taken have in fact been completed.
But personnel action in this case represents no loss of pay. People either retired or are still being paid. They simply don't have the jobs they had. Is that correct?
That's a decision that's made at the Department, Mr. Chairman.
Well, no, and I appreciate it, and you're very important to us, but I just want to make sure I explain it simply. In this case, like in every other case practically, nobody gets fired in the sense that the private sector understands it. Everyone still gets a pay unless they choose to retire, and then they get their retirement pay. So no one lost a day's pay as a result of their failures to protect millions of dollars of the taxpayers' money, as far as you know. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. My time is expiring, but I'd like to have the second video, not the patent, but the other video quickly shown to get it in the record. And then we'll immediately go to the ranking member. I want to note that this has been edited to make it shorter, but it's all original material. And I want to thank the IG for their efforts to get us as much of this material as they have.
Aw, clap those hands out there, come on.
I was busy Twittering. I almost missed my cue up here. I apologize. So you all saw it, right?
This is a very hard-working group of people.
We are family.
You are our champions.
I got all my colleagues with me. We are family.
I'm so proud to be a part of this great family.
We are family. I got all my colleagues with me.
You, the HR practitioner in the field, are the ones who are sending the message for us.
Get up, everybody, and sing.
I feel like a movie star up here. Isn't this a fantastic stage?
As we walk on by.
I repeat again General Shinseki's statement that there's a problem with the culture. I yield to the ranking member.
The Inspector General's report stated that more than a year after the Orlando conferences, VA was unable, Inspector General, to account for all conference costs. The VA's original estimate was that the 2 conferences cost $5.8 million, but when the Inspector General's office reconstructed the expenses, they found about $300,000 in additional costs. Is that right?
That's a partially accurate description. There were actually 8 or 9 different attempts to come up with the number by the Department, and we came up with the 6.1 figure as the best we could determine based on the available records that VA had.
So did the VA know how much the conferences cost?
No.
And why do you think that was? I mean, it seems as if, if you are doing conferences, you would logically keep some type of accounting. I mean, you look at your bills, you look at your, your invoices and whatever. I mean, can you try to explain as best you can, first of all, the difference between what you found and what they were saying, and then why it is and what recommendation did you make to go to that problem?
Well, there were a number of different issues that led to the eventual lack of oversight and the lack of having an ability to come up with a precise figure. The original budget numbers that were presented to the Chief of Staff that he approved changed radically. The number of people to be trained was moved down by 1,200. It was supposed to be 3,000 for $8 million. It became 1,800 were going to be trained. And based on a service level agreement that was executed a month before the hearing, the total cost was projected to move up to $9.3 million. The problem is no one was in charge. It was an HR conference. Accountability started with the Assistant Secretary. There are 2 SES employees, and between the 3 of them, they never had a single meeting to discuss the conference planning, conference cost, etc. So the budget that the Chief of Staff signed off on, after that day, it vanished, and there was no spend plan, there was no cost tracking, there were credit card purchases made above the authorized contract level of the purchaser. One individual made 10 purchases that had a value over $100,000 when his contract didn't allow him to make purchases above $3,000.
Well, did they have a budget?
They had a dollar figure that they put in front of the Chief of Staff, but after that, no one paid too much attention to that.
Well, Mr. Murray, according to the VA's September 2012 memorandum, VA officers involved in planning a conference were mandated to fully integrate their budget officers into conference planning decisions in order to ensure fiscal discipline. Can you tell us whether this has been implemented and discuss what difference it makes to the conference budgeting process, and do they have budgets now?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative, for that question. Indeed, they do. A responsible a conference certifying executive now has to review the business case, the rationale, the outcomes for any proposed conference. If it's above $20,000, a second executive has to serve as the responsible conference executive and certify and affirm those costs in writing in an after-action report. So I feel that the discipline is very strong in the process now. I might add that my expectation, and I do this every day with the auditors because we get an external audit, and we have 14 clean audit opinions, which may surprise some. But fiscal officers, accounting professionals, budget officers are required to keep documentations to support transactions, whether they're a travel obligation, a travel transaction, a contract transaction, you name it, purchasing payroll. Yeah, but it's in place now, Representative.
And finally, let me ask you this. The 2012 memo also directed the creation of a web-based portal in order to, and I quote, accomplish the data collection and reporting activities associated with conference activity by October 1st, 2012. Has that been taken care of?
That automated portal is not complete. We are collecting the data, but the portal that actually collects the data is not complete.
Well, it's already a year after the deadline. What's the problem?
We're working with the Office of Information Technology on the portal.
When do you expect it to be done?
We will have to get back to you with
Can you give us something in writing with a date that you expect it to be done? I mean, we're already over a year late, and it's a bit much. I think we can do better. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Farisi, you were there. You weren't there while this took place, right?
No, I was not.
Okay. Mr. Murray, you were there when this took place?
I was, sir.
Yeah. And what's your title? It looks like it's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Finance?
Yes, sir.
So you were overseeing finance for VA during this period when this took place?
I was yes, sir. I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Finance.
This is a list, Ms. Farisi, of 25 pages, 399 conferences, $86.5 million. that was spent, Mr. Murray, you aware of this, in 2011 for conferences? Were you aware that this was taking place?
We were aware that there were a lot of conferences.
Ms. Farisi, do they need 399 conferences and spend almost $87 million, VA?
Congressman, I can't answer if they needed them. I wasn't there.
Well, again, right now, for the first 9 months of 2012, I have the information you spent $7.5 million for 9 months. Would that be a little bit more in line with what you would recommend?
Congressman, I think you have to look at the type of training that was being done at the conferences.
So far, 9 months this year, you spent 7.5, and they spent $87 million for this entire year. Again, outrageous. You know, I think the American people are sort of fed up with this. These are the $20,000 drumsticks from GSA that they spent. We had the guy in the hot tub with a conference in Las Vegas thumbing his nose. In Las Vegas, then we conducted the IRS. We had the squirting fish that cost thousands of dollars in gifts to employees. And now we have VA. The VA. I have no problem with a conference in Orlando. I don't represent the tourist area, but north of there. I have no problem with a conference in Las Vegas where GSA got in trouble. It's the spending and the amount of spending that goes on. Now, you testified, Inspector General, that people accepted gifts, right? And 3 resigned. And I'm told also that there were $43,000 in bonuses to conference planners. Is that correct? I can't hear you. For the record?
That is correct.
And there are still people here. Mr. Murray was there, and he was somewhat in charge of finances, paying the bills for this while it went on. Many who were involved, many continue to receive salary and benefits. Would you say that's correct, Mr.?
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Now, they spent almost $100,000 in gifts. This is $20,000 outrageous. Bring the teddy bear in. Am I correct? Was it over $97,000 in gifts for employees and trinkets and stuff?
That's
okay,
correct.
and were some rewarded with? Now I'm told that this is the teddy bear. Told that some were rewarded with big stuffed teddy bears. Maybe not this one, but is that correct, Mr.?
I can't speak to that, sir.
All right. The information that we have is this was one of the prizes that was given. So taxpayers not only paying for drumsticks, squirting fish, and now with VA teddy bears. It's absolutely outrageous that, again, people are sending their money to Washington asking us to be good stewards, and particularly offensive for the Veterans Administration, where we should be spending every penny for our veterans. So I'm offended by this. And then the Cleanup Act is almost just as offensive. When you were made aware of this, what did they do, Mr. Murray? Do you know they hired some contractors to look at the spending? Is that correct?
There were contractors hired to look.
2 contractors. One got about $188,000, the other over $200,000, right?
Correct.
$400,000 to look at the spending. Outrageous spending to look at the outrageous spending. Do you think this is in line? I mean, we had the Inspector General look at this. You offered, 49 recommendations for improvement, right?
That's correct.
And how many have been implemented? I understand about half. Is that right, Ms. Farisi?
Congressman, yes, the personnel
About
actions
half.
were complete. Well, and the directive and the handbook will complete
And what'd you do with the $400,000 worth of reports that were paid for, contractor reports to look at the spending of the spending?
Those reports were actionable to how we complete our policy. It was an objective review that was completed by an outside organization to look at all of VA and not just look at HR&A.
Now, some people are going to isn't there at least one criminal referral, Mr. Griffin?
There was a criminal referral, and it was declined for prosecution by the Department of Justice.
So that person is not going to be prosecuted.
That's correct.
And we had one witness here who refused to testify of 3 who were implicated in wrongdoing, and I believe that was accepting gifts also. Is that right?
That's correct. On the one that we had the declination on, he accepted a number of gifts.
All right. Again, it's sad. I know my members feel the same way when you see the waste in GSA, IRS, and now VA. It's pretty offensive to us, the taxpayers, and particularly today our veterans. Let me recognize now who's next? Ms. Norton. Mr. Lynch, I'm sorry. We'll go to Mr. Lynch if you're ready.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for coming forward and helping the committee with its work. I do realize that this is a 2011 conference, and there was an extensive investigation previously done by the Committee on Veterans Affairs. So this is not exactly a timely hearing, but it does point out some examples of waste, fraud, and abuse that this committee is certainly charged with the responsibility to eradicate. I have to say, though, that I have 3 VA facilities in my district. I have the Brockton VA Hospital, I have the West Roxbury VA Hospital, and I have the Jamaica Plain VA Hospital. And I am a frequent flyer to my VA hospitals. I visit them on a regular basis, as well as Walter Reed, Bethesda. And the people that I see there that care for our veterans on a daily basis are not at all reflected in the investigation that is ongoing here. And it is sad. I agree with the Chairman's statement. It is sad to see the attacks, or the allegations, excuse me, on the VA in a broad stroke. I would hate to think that the American people think that my doctors, my nurses, my staff, my therapists who are working at the VA hospitals their service is indicative of what we are hearing today. It is not. The doctors, the nurses, the staff, the therapists at the VA, in the City of Boston, they are staying and working at the VA. Number one, a lot of them are veterans. As I go through the corridors of those hospitals, a lot of the folks that are serving our veterans, and especially those coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as a lot of World War II veterans who have never in their life had to rely on the VA, but do now, Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans. Those docs, those nurses, those staff, therapists, they're working for less than what they could earn if they walked across the street and worked at a private hospital in the Boston area. There's some hospitals there that are very generous in their benefits and their pay. But our VA employees, they do the right thing because they believe in their service. They're intentionally staying at the VA so that they can, we all want to spend our lives in a meaningful cause, and I think that a lot of our VA employees do so because they believe deeply in serving our veterans, and they do so for all the right reasons. And it pains me greatly to see the administration of the VA caught up in this crap and diminishing the excellent service of those employees at the VA. That's what pains me more than anything. I know that the VA adopted a lot of the recommendations of the Office of the Inspector General, and I'm happy to see that. And there is a problem here. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this at all. There's a problem here, and we have to make sure that the way the VA is administered at the top is reflective of the way those docs and nurses and therapists serve every single day in the VA hospitals and the VA facilities around this country, and indeed reflect the honor and the dignity that is due to our veterans. That's the bottom line here. That's the bottom line. The job that is being done at the VA should be reflective of the dignity and the sacrifice and the noble intent of those who have served. And this is such a departure. It's disgraceful. It is disgraceful. So we got to get at this thing. And you know, I know some heads have rolled, and that's good. They deserve to go. There's a real disconnect between the wonderful, gracious, noble service of our veterans and what's going on that we're uncovering in this hearing. And I think it's a disgrace. And so, you know, I think that the administration of the VA should take a look at their VA hospitals, look at the people who are working there, look at the dignity and the sacrifice and the dedication that they exert in caring for our veterans, and look at the veterans who are lying in those hospital beds. The VA administration ought to go visit. They ought to make it mandatory that you walk through maybe once a week, a couple of times a month, walk through that VA hospital so you know who you're working for. I think that would change your attitude 100%. You know who you work for, because those are America's best. Those are America's best who did what they did for all the right reasons, and the service of the VA should be, as I say, reflective of that wonderful service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I'm going to ask unanimous consent of myself and the committee here to put these figures in, which I did, and I just want the members to know what they're doing today and what you've done to date, the results. The GSA spending went from $37 million in 2010 to $4.9 million on conferences. GSA from 10.9 to 1.3 last year. And then we heard today from nearly $87 million to $7.5 million so far. So these hearings are having an impact. Let me yield to the without objection. This will be made part of the record. And let me recognize Mr. Walberg.
I thank the Chairman, and it is important work that we are doing, and I think it's good that you mentioned those figures and the changes that take place. It's kind of ugly work as well that we do, but it's necessary. And especially in context, and I certainly would identify my thoughts and emotions with the previous member, Mr. Lynch, about the concern of what's taking place here. And Ms. Farrisee, I certainly wish you all the best in attempting to lead to get to the bottom of this and deal with the recommendations, all 49 of them, plus any more that would be helpful that will go on. The number two concern that's brought to my district office and my office here in Washington from my citizens back in my district are VA issues, and the frustration that we continue to have with the backlog that makes it difficult to get the information necessary or the records necessary for our veterans that are expanding with the present war situations that we're in. And I, too, have the privilege to visit veterans, wounded warriors at Walter Reed, and then back in my district at the Ann Arbor VA hospital, and see the care that they're receiving that's second to none, and the quality upgrades of facilities that are taking place. So to think that we're wasting resources not on necessary planning and upgrading of skills, but on things like we have had come across our desks in recent history with departments that are spending for videos of Dr. Spock, and now we see a parody of Patton, and attempt to get the Washington Redskins cheerleaders for the event. I mean, it's just, it shouldn't happen. I'd like to queue up an email and specifically refers to one of the lead planners of this conference and her concerns, and especially stated, if that email could be queued up, if you'll notice that she expresses concern, where she says, obviously the money is not an issue. That's a stark statement when we talk about $6.1 million spent on this conference, while the VA is exempted from sequestration because of a concern that veterans' issues be addressed. When we add $1.6 billion increase to deal with the backlog that right now is at over 700,000 benefit claims backlog, some in my district. Ms. Farrisee, why were conference planners unconcerned with budgetary constraints from what you found out in your short period of time already?
Congressman, I believe there was a lack of leadership and oversight and any kind of good direction and purpose given to the planners.
Is this, from what you've seen so far, an overarching attitude towards spending throughout the Department?
Congressman, no, it is not. I have seen the policies put into place and the accountability that now exists at the Department.
A second slide I'd like to point out was a concerned employee who stated, please know that I'm willing to help where I can, but the scope of the kickoff has grown immensely, and the work necessary to ensure that the kickoff is a success is beyond what I can balance with my regular work. Why were planners allowed to forego their normal work tasks for the Department in favor of planning conferences?
Congressman, I can't answer that question because I was not there, but I will go back to, I do not think there was good leadership, oversight on what was happening. I do not think that the leadership even knew at these levels everything that was happening.
Were they ever told? Were employees ever told that they were to forego work? Have you found that to be the case?
I have not found that to be the case, but I do not know what happened during this time, Congressman.
Again, 717,000 backlog, benefit claims backlog. I mean, there's work to be done, and that does not send a positive message. Mr. Griffin, I would ask you a question relative to the 49 directives. I would assume the majority of those are considered high directives. There are 26 as far as the first of this month that we know of that have not been addressed. Could you describe the potential cost savings that could come about by addressing these 26 unmet directives that have been given for improvement, priority improvement?
I think what our work was able to demonstrate for these two conferences was that there was at least $762,000 that could have been used for better purposes than trinkets and some of the other excesses that occurred. The application to all VA conferences, clearly there is money to be saved. I think some of the numbers that were mentioned by the Chairman reflect that there has been a huge reduction.
Significant reductions.
Frankly, the September 2012 memo from the Chief of Staff was very thorough. I thought it was aggressive. We just need to get to the finish line, get the book published so everybody has it. There's a certain protocol and process that it has to go through to put a handbook on the street in VA. We need to finish that to make sure that all of the good plans get enacted. I did think that the memo of the end of September, which was issued a couple of days before the release of our report, was an aggressive attempt to rein in costs. And I think it addressed one of the principal shortcomings in the HR conferences in that nobody was in charge.
Thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Gentleman's comments expired. Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me first of all associate myself with the remarks made by Mr. Lynch and Mr. Walberg relative to the services of VA medical facilities. I have two in my district One, the Hines VA in Hines, Illinois, is closely affiliated with Loyola University Medical Center, where they provide, both combined, some of the best medical care in the world for any person, certainly the veterans that they serve. And I also have the pleasure of having the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center, which is named for the former secretary who had a very distinguished career in both the military and as Secretary of Veterans Affairs in his service to the country. So we certainly want to extol the virtues of those facilities and what they do. I think it is most unfortunate that this kind of hearing is necessary. Mr. Griffin, let me ask you, the IG report highlights inappropriate and unauthorized use of government purchase cards to spend more than $200,000 on the two 2011 conferences. Basically, when conference planners wanted to spend money on the conferences, they just charged it to their government credit cards, even when they went over their authorized limits and didn't have approvals. Is that correct? And at least 7 employees did this?
I'm sorry. How many?
7?
Yes.
The report also indicated that the primary event planner was able to circumvent his $3,000 purchasing limit by making 10 separate purchases totaling more than $100,000. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you explain how this employee was able to circumvent Federal and VA acquisition regulations?
Well, there's supposed to be a review process in place where someone looks at purchase card activity and makes sure that, first of all, that it is for the purpose of serving our nation's veterans and not for something else. That review process is supposed to happen to every card holder. But if you have a card and you have a contract that says you are not authorized to make a purchase over $3,000, and you do anyway, the vendor doesn't know that VA put a $3,000 limit on you. They'll just take your card and hit it for $10,000. So the problem is that in actuality, the person you're talking about, his contract was not even valid because he had moved from Veterans Health Care over to this new assignment, and his authority didn't transfer with him. So it's one of the areas that the Department is addressing to tighten down, and frankly, we're doing some additional work in the area of purchase cards to make sure that things are in order.
Ms. Farrisee, let me ask you, what has the Department done, or what is the Department doing to correct this?
Congressman, I am going to turn that over to Mr. Murray from the Finance Office.
Thank you for that question, Representative. We did upon immediately learning that this had occurred. And let me be clear that there was an approving official that should have reviewed each of those purchases and signed off of them, as well as a more senior agency program coordinator that should have looked at those purchases. So I mean, it was quite dismaying, disappointing. I think we were as shocked as anybody that it occurred, that many folks could do the wrong thing. But what we did immediately is not just look at the HR purchase card transactions. We looked at the entire Department of Veterans Affairs purchase cards transactions. And we immediately got with the Office of Acquisitions, and we said, we need to know definitively who has the elevated purchasing authorities and who does not. And for those that do not have those elevated purchasing authorities, we check every Monday, and if they don't have it, we reduce those cards to the $3,000 micro-purchase limit. So, you know, the oversight controls went strong, went quick, went in fast. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me just ask Mr. Griffin, did you find these steps to be adequate?
I haven't reviewed the entire response in that area. I'm not sure if our follow-up team has felt like it meets the requirements of the recommendation or not, but I'd be pleased to give you an answer for the record to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and we will be keeping the record open. We'll have an announcement on that later. Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've been actively involved in conference overspending and have actually sponsored bills with respect to this. But the VA spending on conferences, to me, seems more egregious than any of the others, especially when you look at the backlog of claims some of our veterans are facing. And we're looking at 717,000 backlog claims in excess of 125 days in some cases. And so if you'll, I'm going to digress for a second on those backlog claims to set the stage for some conference questions. Secretary Shinseki sought to blame the claims backlog on the government shutdown when he testified before Congress on October 9th. And I'd like to ask you, Ms. Farisi, is it true that the Department only furloughed 4% of its employees during the government shutdown?
At the time of the shutdown, yes, there would have been more employees furloughed had the government not come back on.
We got it going in only 4%. Let me ask Mr. Murray, since you're the finance guy. The VA has pretty much been exempted from cuts and sequestration. Is that correct?
It depends on the program. For instance, we did furlough OIT, information technology employees.
All right. And isn't it true that Congress has pretty much met every request from the Department to increase its funding to process the backlog claims? I believe the Department actually received around $300 million in the continuing resolution that would have ended the shutdown. So it seems the VA has the money to reduce the backlog of claims. Why haven't we seen a significant decrease, and where do we see this problem getting solved? Ms. Farisi, I'll let you take a stab at that.
Congressman, the Secretary's goal is 2015 for the backlog on those records. They have made significant progress. They have used the use of overtime. They have trained the employees. Training is critical to the mission. Training is critical to us being able to continue.
Well, let us talk for a second about backlog, or I'm sorry, about overtime, because during this process, the committee, and during these investigations of the conference spending, the committee found the Department employees received overtime pay for days in which they participated in activities entirely unrelated to the conferences. I have a problem with overtime to plan the conferences to begin with, but we're looking at helicopter rides and spa treatments. I mean, wouldn't that overtime have been better spent on employees who are actually processing veterans' claims?
Congressman, absolutely right. That is extremely disturbing, and I would expect my leaders in the future to have and execute good fiduciary responsibilities.
All right. Well, earlier this year, the House passed H.R. 313, the Government Spending and Accountability Act of 2013, which caps non-military spending on conferences and requires a detailed, itemized report on federal conference spending. That bill is designed to ensure that conferences are for training and work purposes rather than taxpayer-funded vacations. It also adds transparencies and measures to remove loopholes from the President's Executive Order 13589 entitled Promoting Effective Spending. Earlier this year, I sponsored that bill, and it was passed. Unfortunately, it appears, at least in this case, and this is before the bill, the VA people lost sight of what the purposes of these conferences were for training. And we have no itemized expense report for those. And Mr. Griffin, you've testified you don't think there's a way to actually find out how much was spent. Is that correct?
We did the best we could to review available receipts, and that's where we came up with the number, but we are not confident that that is 100% of the expense.
Ms. Farisi, Mr. Murray, don't you think it's important that we keep detailed information on what we're spending the taxpayers' money on?
It is extremely important, and the new policies that were put into place in 2012 will allow us to keep this information. And when the handbook and directive are out, we'll complete that. But we have been doing that kind of accountability since 2012.
And I understand you all are working on a web portal for some of this information. Do we have any idea what that's costing, we're not going in the healthcare.gov $600 million range, are we?
Can you answer that?
I do not, but we can take a look at that.
All right. It seems the government has a bad habit of spending a little bit too much money on websites. But that being said, is there a process in place to try to move some of this training that's done at these high-dollar conferences to online? You look at what the general trend is in the training community now. You look at sites like lynda.com, totaltraining.com. You've got GoToMeeting and Google Hangouts, all sorts of opportunities to do this online. Do y'all have can you give me a quick overview of what y'all are trying to do to move more of this stuff online?
Congressman, yes, you're absolutely right. We have a talent management system which has numerous courses online. We do webcasts, we do other virtual blended training, and we are looking into the future to continue to do more of that training because we absolutely agree training can be accomplished in other forms.
All right. Well, I see that my time has expired.
Thank the
you very much,
gentleman.
Mr.
Let me
Chairman.
recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And by the way, you looked really good with that teddy bear up there. Very nice.
Anything is an improvement. Thank you.
Ms. Farisi, Tammy Duckworth, Congresswoman Duckworth, wanted me to point out that you are here after a 30-year career in the United States Army, retiring as a Major General. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, Congressman.
Well, on behalf of certainly Congresswoman Duckworth and myself, and I know my colleagues, thank you for your 30-year service in the U.S. Army to your country.
Thank you. It's been my privilege.
Let me ask a question of, well, first of all, Mr. Murray, you answered something, I think, to Mr. Farenthold on furloughs. He asked whether only 4% of the veterans' workforce was furloughed and which parts were furloughed. And you, inter alia, answered our IT people.
Right. Actual furlough notices did go out to our information technology, not all of them, not the ones that were actually at the medical centers, but some that did not meet the necessary implication that the high bar were furloughed.
Well, this committee particularly, that has a resonant tone to it because we are very struck with the fact that IT has properly deployed and invested in can really make a difference in terms of adding capability and capacity, especially in a resource-thin era. One of the things that IT capacity for the Veterans Administration was being deployed for was to eat into the notorious backlog of applications and claims. Is that not correct?
That is one of the programs they support.
So those people were furloughed for 16 days.
I do not specifically know the status of those individuals.
Ms. Farisi, do you know the status of those individuals?
I know that all of the OINT were not furloughed. Some were in what we considered an accepted status to be able to continue to support.
Did it disrupt our eating into the backlog? Because you've actually made progress in the last year, about 30% eating into that backlog. Is that correct?
We have, and it did make a difference because the employees were furloughed also from the VBA.
So we in Congress can't have it both ways. We can't beat up on you on the fact that you got a backlog, and then we shut down the government, forcing you to make some tough decisions about who gets furloughed and who doesn't, hampering an effort that otherwise had actually been showing significant progress. Mr. Griffin, do conferences have any management value at all from your point of view?
Absolutely. In our report, we indicated that we determined that the training was valid training and that the previous training that had been conducted, which was in 2009, hit a small percentage of the HR staff. So we felt that the actual training was justified.
And there was a lot of training going on, even at the conferences where We Are Family video was just shown.
Yeah, we included the training agenda as an appendix to our report so people could see what the courses were, how long they lasted, and so on.
And I didn't understand your answer to Mr. Davis. This happened 2 years ago. the particular incident we're talking about. Have you reviewed new procedures, given we have a lot of new people, including Ms. Farisi, in place to clean up what happened? Are you satisfied that there are new protocols, policies, and procedures in place to prevent excess spending, frivolous spending from occurring from legitimate training conferences and other parts of conferencing that can really help in terms of networking and the like?
I think that it's a work in progress. I know that, as I mentioned previously, the memorandum that came out 4 days before the issuance of our report laid down a lot of very important markers that people would have to meet at future conferences. But we need to finish up about half of the recommendations, which are still in various stages of completion.
Briefly, Ms. Farisi, could you address that? How confident are you that we've developed protocols, procedures, and policies that would satisfy the IG's office and, more importantly, satisfy the American people that the investments we do make in legitimate training and conferences is wisely invested?
I am confident that the policy that was put out in 2012 was the first and large step in doing that. Included in this policy is a form called the Conference Certification Form, which prohibits many things that had happened at that conference, prohibits things like purchasing of entertainment and many of the waste, fraud, and abuse that you all have discussed here today. And so we have already put those into place. It will be in a directive, it will be in a handbook by December, but it has evolved over this last year, and we look forward to our handbook.
And if the Chairman would just allow one final, just technical. In answer to the Chairman Iss's question about would you be willing to provide a draft of that handbook, you said you've already provided it.
Have they?
It was one of the responses we have provided.
When was that provided?
In the OIG report, October 23rd. It was one of the responses.
Okay, so just about a week ago. Gotcha. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. And we have had trouble. We haven't gotten a lot of information late in July, unfortunately, and then that just before the hearing. Mr. Benevolio, you recognize.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Farisi, did I pronounce that correctly?
Congressman, it's Farisi.
Farisi, thank you. I stand corrected. And thank you for your service. I, too, spent some time at Fort Knox. I was medevaced out of Iraq in 2007. Iraq. Michigan, we say Iraq for some reason. And I was at the Warrior Transition Unit in October of 2007. Were you there at that time?
I was not, but you would not recognize the new Warrior Transition Center. They've opened a wonderful new facility at Fort Knox.
Yeah, since when? 2007 or before that?
Oh, they didn't open the facility until 2013.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear, because when I got there, everybody was in a hullabaloo because the soldier had died in the barracks. It's a Warrior Transition Unit for wounded and injured soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq. They said, you don't understand. I said, what don't I understand? So they didn't find his body for 4 days. The Army said 12 hours. The newspaper said 2 days. The boots on the ground said he opened his pizza on a Friday, and they found him Monday night. My own experience there, I waited 6 hours for the pharmacist to tell me they didn't carry the prescription. Come back on Thursday, and when I went back on Thursday, they had forgotten to requisition that medication for my neck injury. And when I got out, I went back from, you get discharged from active duty, you go back to your National Guard unit, and I was ordered to go and apply for VA benefits. Ordered. Because being a Vietnam veteran, 30 years ago, with my experience with VA, I didn't want anything to do with it. Do you understand? You're familiar with those feelings? Vietnam veterans?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and Mr. Connolly, Congressman Connolly mentioned, sorry he's not here, but he said there's been a 30% improvement with the, thank you, Mr. Connolly, 30% improvement, and that's since 1973. That's 1% improvement for the last 30 years as far as I'm concerned, because I am a veteran and I have direct experience with the VA. The orders I was given, I filled out my paperwork and waited 11 months for the VA to tell me they had lost my medical records. Luckily, being an old soldier, I made hard copies, and so I took them down to the Detroit VA and stood behind the gentleman as he photocopied a stack about 8 inches tall of my medical records. And within 60 days, I had my disability, 50%. As a congressman, I toured the facilities and got the dog and pony show. They were very gracious, very professional. I saw a lot of new improvements to the VA, but when I talked to some of my constituents that come in handling our casework, I see the same story that I saw in 1973. I have a question. You've been a general in the military. Are you familiar with FM 105 or 101-5?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, it's the officer's Bible. It's called Staff Organizations and Operations.
Okay, yes,
You're
I am
familiar
familiar
with
with that.
Could somebody hand her this here, please? Chapter 4. Page 1 of FM, I've circled it there for you. 101-5 states. Could you read that for me, please?
Yes, I
Where
will.
I circled it?
Yes, I will, Congressman. The commander is responsible for all that his staff does or fails to do. He cannot delegate this responsibility. The final decision, as well as the final responsibility, remains with the commander.
And you carried that Army training with you to the VA, correct?
Correct.
Great. Can you tell me why commanders are responsible for the actions and attitudes of those under them?
Because we are placed in that position of responsibility, and we must incur that responsibility for every action.
So in the military, the actions of the service members under a commander's authority are often directly attributed to the leadership and culture of the group, correct?
Correct.
The VA is no exception. The disgraceful attitudes and lack of concern over wasting taxpayers' funds can only be explained by the fact that the leadership of the VA is flawed. Until the stagnant attitudes at the very top of the VA are eliminated, we cannot truly hope to eliminate the many problems plaguing the VA that, in the end, are hurting our veterans the most. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I'm new to Congress. I was a taxpayer, worked in the service, served my country in 2 wars. And I see the IRS, EPA, the Energy Department, and now the VA wasting taxpayers' money. What do you think I should do? What can I do to stop that from happening? Because what I think is I'd like to fire you all and start over. That's my feeling. But what's reality? Reality is I got to work with you. How am I going to get improvements, 100% improvements, more than 100% improvements? Because all I saw is 30% improvement over the last 30 years. That's 1% a year. Do I got to wait until 2083 to get 100% from the VA?
Congressman, I believe that the department is working, and we plan to work faster than that.
I heard that for 30 years. Actions speak louder than words. What are you going to do tomorrow to eliminate that backlog, to get it done? Because that backlog is the same backlog we had in 1973, 1974, 1975. Is that, you know, if you want something screwed up, let the government do it. That's the way I look at it. That's not what my taxpayers are expecting. I want quality service to our veterans, not tomorrow, well, tomorrow and next week, not in 2083.
I thank the gentleman, and he yields back the balance of his time. Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just let me say, as I begin this series of questions, the backlog is not the same backlog. And that's one of my concerns here, because this agency has been given responsibilities it did not have, and when I thought that there was going to, it did not have in previous administrations. So when I thought initially that there was, when I heard initially it was a VA hearing, I said, oh, it must be on the backlog of claims. Of course, the reason we look so closely now at VA is that the President, hearing all the complaints about from veterans about post-traumatic syndrome, change the standard so that making it more possible for people, veterans, to show PSDT. And it's not in the same backlog. There's probably always been a backlog. But that's the reason this agency, I think, is under very, very real scrutiny. Now, we've had hearings here and, in fact, in 2 of my committees on conferences. Now, the first, and I note that this conference was held in 2011, so perhaps the VA was not on, quote, fair notice. But in April of 2012, there were hearings about the GSA conferences. And those hearings resulted in literally the beheading of the top of the agency, the very top of the agency administrator, the GSA administrator, and the person who headed the main division of GSA, the Public Building Service. These occurred in 2011, and there was some evidence that this kind of conference goings-on has been systematic in federal agencies for many years now. What made us take very special note was, of course, the outlandish GSA conference, but also the fact that we were in very hard times, and we still are. Now, Mr. Griffin, you have testified that there was, in most of these instances, failure of the senior officials to give the proper oversight. Now, one begins to wonder about conferences in hard times and about conferences with agencies that have an additional backlog, not the Vietnam backlog, not the backlog, but an additional backlog. Now, as far as I asked staff, as far as I could figure out, Mr. Griffin, they said training did occur, and we think about 12% might be chalked off to entertainment, even waste, with most of it going to training. Is that correct, in these conferences?
I can't put a percentage on it for you, Ms. Norton. They did have plenary sessions in the beginning, in the morning.
Were these conferences largely devoted to training which we understand the VA staff may have needed? I just spoke about PSDT. Or was a disproportionate amount of time spent on these other activities?
I wouldn't say it was disproportionate.
Yeah, it's important.
There were 4 hours of classroom training, if you will, each day.
4 hours each day.
Right. And there was a plenary session in the morning, and there was a plenary session at the end of the day.
Was the plenary, you count that in the 4 hours, or that's an addition?
No.
Yeah. So it's important to note, this is an agency that needed training. They're working on a wholly new form of disability that the VA had not fully recognized before. Now, I ran a federal agency, and I am with those who say that, of course, you don't want to wipe out all opportunities to have some fun, particularly people who are under the kinds of pressure that the VA is under. So the fact that it's important to note that these people may have had some steam to let off, and that kind of stuff out of context never tells me anything. You know, because if that happened, for example, in one of this 12% of the time, I'm not so sure that would have been so bad. So that doesn't tell me anything. What tells me much more is what we did not learn from the GSA conference, and that is that most of the time there was being spent, as apparently it was here, on training. And I must say, given PSDT, that needed training. Now, of course, if you head a government agency and you're overburdened and you're a senior official, then you designate somebody else or you hire someone else. Now, they have designated a conference certifying official, and he has all kinds of duties. Mr. Griffin, we now must have a conference certifying official, and he's responsible for seeing the after-action review, for seeing the special training. That's not a new hire, is it? Ms. Pharisee, that's not a new hire, is it?
No, Congresswoman, it is not a new hire.
So those are duties in addition to duties that, let me just suggest that as important as the training is, and I'm almost through, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, it's difficult to understand how somebody who has the agency's mandate now with this extra backlog, in addition to whatever backlog you may have had, it's going to be very difficult to do what is the central function of the agency and pay a lot of attention, as you now require, given what has been discovered, to conferences. And I think the agency is going to have to look very carefully at what I would normally regard as a very important activity and see if the training can be done as training, perhaps in the locations, because I just don't see how this conference certifying official, as important and responsible as that designation is going to be able to do that and do what Congress is really looking at you to do, and that is to get rid of this backlog and deal with our veterans. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I first want to commend Mr. Bentivoglio for his courage in speaking out in the way in which he did. Apparently, there are some or maybe many employees of the VA that think that they are immune from criticism because they know that all members of Congress want to support the veterans. And I can tell you that my father was the State Legion Commander in 1954. My Uncle Joe was State Legion Commander in 1963. And those were times in the 50s and 60s when the American Legions around the country were huge. And I'm a product of Boys State, and now one of the, I think it's only about 19% of the Congress who are veterans. I'm proud of my service and appreciated the education and opportunities that I got from the military. On the other hand, I know that most veterans don't want to see the taxpayers abused or money wasted, even in the VA. And we have this, I want to commend Mr. Griffin and Mr. Abe for the work that they've done. We have this report that says there was an email in which one department employee said, "We are a large agency with deep pockets." And it says, "This email response was indicative of a larger problem throughout the conference planning process. Planners disregarded any budgetary concerns and engaged in out-of-control spending. They exercised extremely poor stewardship of taxpayer dollars." That's a very disturbing report. General Pharisee, in a time of a massive $17 trillion debt that's headed up much higher, much faster than ever before, how does a statement like this, that we're a large agency with deep pockets, how do you think that reflects on the department?
It is a very troubling statement, Congressman. I do not believe it reflects well. I do not believe that is the thought process today. I do believe that fiduciary responsibilities are taken very seriously, and the policies that have been put in place will eliminate those type of thoughts.
Well, another email obtained by the committee, a department employee stated, "In this place, you have to get it all when you can." And we've heard that and read that this $6.1 million on these conferences, so that that planners. It says planners spent, I think Mr. Griffin said $762,000 or some figure like that. Was that the figure, Mr. Griffin, on trinkets?
The total overspend was $762 as far as we could determine.
Right, but it could have been more. And then we have in this report that the planners were using these trips to these various resort locations as just paid vacations by the taxpayers. It seems to me that this type of activity needs to be stopped and needs to be restricted if the employees of the VA are patriotic, dedicated employees. This will stop. General Farrisee, why do you think conference planners were able to maximize spending on these promotional products? Didn't any supervisors step in to say that these amounts were too high, or did they just not control this much at all?
Congressman, I believe there was a lack of oversight through this whole conference planning. There was not enough leadership attention to all the details.
Well, we certainly hope that this stops. All this money, instead of being paid vacations for VA employees, as others have said, could have been spent in many, many better ways. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On October 1st, 2012, the Inspector General's Office publicly released a report issuing 49 recommendations on conference oversight, internal controls, and spending. Mr. Griffin, how many recommendations did Secretary Shinseki concur with?
The Secretary concurred with all of the recommendations.
And in fact, the VA had already issued a conference oversight memorandum that began implementing many of those recommendations when the report was released. Is that correct?
Yeah, we shared our draft report with the Department in August. They had an opportunity to see what the issues were, and as I previously testified, they did generate an aggressive memorandum laying out new guidance to try and address a lot of the issues.
How many of the 49 recommendations has the Department finished implementing?
You know, we got a flurry of activity in the past few days, which is a byproduct of hearings, so we're grateful for the hearing. Roughly half is my belief, but we'll get you an answer with the precise number for the record. We track these recommendations on a quarterly basis. We send a reminder to the Department that this is still an open recommendation, and how are you progressing on getting to closure on it. So it's a process that we have had in place. I'm told now by my colleague that 26 of the 49 are open.
So 26?
26 out of 49 remain open. So there's been some exchange of information back and forth between our follow-up staff and the Department, where indications are that progress is being made, but we have not gotten enough information to say that they've met the requirements of the recommendation.
So there are 23 that are still in process?
No, there are 26. 23 are closed, 26 are open.
Okay. And of the 26 that are open, where is the Department in the process and the progress, and what is the follow-up on the implementation until they are completed?
I can't speak to all 26 of them. I've seen some of the responses, and as I've indicated, there is progress being made, but we're not going to close those recommendations until we're satisfied that they've nailed it. And so far, that's not the case in all of them.
Is there a date?
3 of them involve personnel actions, which I understand the Department intends to conclude tomorrow.
Is there a date certain when they have to all be completed by?
We will follow up until they're done.
But there's not a deadline?
There's not a deadline, but as things tend to get older, we do send a past due list to the Congress every quarter to bring it to their attention that some of these things have been out there for a long time, and we seek to get any assistance we can in making sure that the Department understands the importance and takes care of the problem.
Okay, so Mr. Farisi, as Mr. Griffin just indicated, the Department now has additional reporting requirements to Congress regarding these conferences. How often is the VA required to report on conference spending?
I'll have to pass that question to Mr. Murray on conference spending.
We have to report conference spending quarterly and annually to the Congress as well as OMB.
And what kind of information is now included in these reports? And who do they go to? Committees on Veterans Affairs. Reports go to the OIG. Reports go to OMB. It's detailed breakdowns on conference spending costs by categories elaborated in the statute. And so the oversight is there for the conference spending on a quarterly and annual basis? I believe it is, and I actually believe there's a lot of oversight before a conference is ever approved, which is where I think the key oversight belongs is, are there alternative methods to do this? Is there another way to accomplish this training short of traveling and leasing a facility and incurring all those incumbent costs? So we make a very strong, we require the activity to make a strong case there first. And then we make them, if they make the case and there's good learning outcomes and they can demonstrate they're good learning, important outcomes that can be measured, then we look at their analysis of different venues. So I think that's where the control exists.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the gentleman. Mr. Meadows, gentleman from North Carolina, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for coming. And I want to start off by saying that there are a tremendous amount of dedicated workers. I know in Veterans Affairs, there's a number of very dedicated employees. Our committee staff here is unbelievably dedicated. They do a great job truly for the American people. So I don't want anything to be misconstrued or out there that there's not an appreciation for those who serve our country and work in government, because these hearings can come out that way. At the same time, we must address a few of these issues, because I've got other governmental agencies saying, why in the world do they get to travel? And I've got people in the Blue Ridge Parkway who can't go from one end of the Blue Ridge Parkway to others in their service area without having to come back because of the unbelievable spending that goes in other areas. With that being said, we've got some $762,000 that was spent, according to the IG's report. And Ms. Farisi, you've said, and Mr. Murray, you've said as well, that top officials didn't know about it. There wasn't the proper oversight. Could you put up an email slide here, cue up the slide for me? This is an email, a senior official email to conference planners that says, and I quote, "Bottom line, you don't have to worry about a thing." Now, when a top official asserts to conference planners that they don't have to worry about the funding, does that not send the wrong message? Mr. Murray?
Absolutely. I mean, it's totally the wrong message.
Okay. When do I get to tell the veterans in North Carolina, of which you do not have a good track record of processing claims in North Carolina? Many of the veterans that I talk to have to wait some as many as 600 days to get their claims handled. When do I get to tell them, bottom line, you don't have to worry about a thing? When are we going to get to that point? Does this type of spending, Ms. Farisi, when we send out a word like this, what does it tell the American people when we say bottom line? Does it show that we have an unlimited budget in the VA?
Congressman, we absolutely don't have an unlimited budget, and I think it shows a past history of bad decisions, bad leadership that controls have been put on.
I agree. So how many people got fired because of the bad leadership and bad decisions? How many? I think I know the answer. How many got fired for bad leadership and bad decisions?
None fired that I am aware of.
Okay. Mr. Murray, how many in your organization got fired?
None in my organization.
Okay. How many of them got disciplined greatly in your organization, Mr. Murray?
There was no discipline in my.
So no discipline, no firings, but yet we have bad leadership and bad decisions. Let's go on a little bit further, because I'm even more troubled by the next slide, if you'll cue this up. Here's an email that the department approved a $450,000 marketing budget for a conference. Now, why do we need such a large marketing budget to make employees go to a conference that they're required to go to? Why would we do that? I mean, who makes that decision? Who would have made the decision to approve that?
The leadership of HRNA at the time would have made that decision.
Okay, and they're still employed, right? This was a good decision on their part to market it?
They are no longer with the VA.
Okay. And you were very kind, Ms. Pharisee, in the way that you responded. And I want to thank you for your service and thank you for the way that you responded. Mr. Murray, I'm a little bit troubled because as we see these emails coming out, don't ever play poker, because you're there rolling your eyes and huffing and having disdain for the IG as these emails come out. Do you think that your organization does a great job, Mr. Murray?
My organization, whenever we become aware of these issues, we find weaknesses in internal controls, whether the IG finds it, General Accountability Office finds it, our internal or external auditors find them, we immediately take actions to correct, mitigate, fix these kind of deficiencies. We have a good collaborative relationship with the IG, and we work in a transparent and accountable fashion with you.
Yeah, but your demeanor today at this hearing doesn't show that. I've been watching you. I watch people all the time, and so your demeanor would indicate that you're a little frustrated by these emails as they roll out, as they're telling a story that, do you agree with the story that this is indicative of those that are making decisions, that they didn't have an accountability for cost?
The employees that work for me, the employees I work with, the leaders I work with, have a strong accountability for the costs, for their actions, exercise good judgment. So I find this very dismaying, very disappointing, sir. And that's the expression I'd like to convey.
All right. So when does this translate into my veterans in North Carolina being able to count the moms and dads, the children, counting on those being taken care of? When are we going to get our act together, not just on conferences? I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Waiting patiently, and last but not least, and I think a day older after celebrating her birthday, the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Luan Grisham. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for recognizing that, yes, indeed, I'm another year older, which, given the alternative, I'm willing to take, and had a nice time last night. Yeah, I know that being maybe the last person to talk, that you're clear that I think both sides, and my colleagues on this committee are clear that in the best of circumstances, our job and yours, no matter how much resources you have or don't have, is to use that funding in the most effective and streamlined way that you can. And that further, that I would agree that where you have the flexibility to move as much of your administrative funds, including training and conferences, into the direct services and benefits where you're actually making a difference for veterans and families directly. Given that I've got 20-plus years in local and state government and worked as a cabinet secretary, I was clear that my dollars that were appropriated for me needed to go to seniors and their families, and that was an effective use of my time.
However, I also recognize that when we react strictly and narrowly, we can also do damage, because if I want you to provide those direct services and benefits in a meaningful way, your staff must be trained and have access to innovative new resources and tools. And if we do get a new software program implemented that really helps with the backlog and is more effective, you're going to need training just at that level. And that's not really what we're talking about here, but I'm a big fan of having appropriately trained and a productive public and private workforce that are doing the best possible job. So I'm certainly not going to be your advocate, and I don't think anybody here is, for spending nearly $1 million on a conference that had marketing, and we know that that's never going to happen again, or your jobs now are to make that happen. I also recognize in a public system there are limitations about how you deal with accountability, and I think that's an area that we ought to do a better job too in terms of holding folks accountable. So thank you for being here. Thank you for owning this problem, and thank you for implementing as many of those recommendations. But I'm going to take a different twist, which is I think that the OMB's reaction might cause harm and not get to the real issue, which is we expect you to be effective and smart and professional about how you spend all of your money, regardless of what it is and what it's intended for. And so I'm going to remind folks that last year OMB ordered federal agencies to reduce travel and conference expenses by 30% by 2016. And then my district is home to Sandia National Laboratories, which is one of the critical players in the nation's complex energy, national defense, cybersecurity, and employs some of the country's best and brightest minds. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from a letter that Dr. Paul Homert, the director of Sandia Laboratories, wrote to me about these restrictions. He shares my concern that these will harm the ability of the national labs in their research, their scientists and engineers to share knowledge and collaborate with their peers in academia and industry. And these interactions are critical to keeping our researchers at the cutting edge in their field. He shares my desire to ensure that we are spending our taxpayer dollars wisely while effectively helping the government accomplish its missions. Dr. Homert offers suggestions for developing standards for evaluating and managing the risk and cost of conference travel spending. And then I ask, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to place the whole letter in the record. And in addition,
without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. And I have another letter that is from the Center for Association Leadership, a watchdog organization, who is also looking at these balances. Clearly, we don't want these mistakes made, but we want to be careful that we don't minimize opportunities that make us a more efficient and effective government. And I would ask unanimous consent to put this letter in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
So that's really my statement. I only have 30 seconds, and I'm not sure if there's anything to respond to, except I hope that what we leave this hearing with is the kinds of issues that we've identified should never come before this committee or anyone else again. We are expecting wise, smart, efficient, effective leadership in all of our public entities, and we want to be sure that the recommendations that you put in place do effectively prohibit this kind of waste, but don't limit the opportunities to have a well-trained, well-recognized, productive workforce. And my fear is we will go too far, and we won't do health research, scientific research, and we won't find the best way to serve our veterans and their families. Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Does the ranking member want to close? Seeing none, Ms. Farrisee, I'm informed by staff that having reviewed what was sent to us as, quote, the manual, entitled Memorandum, without objection to be placed in the record. With all due respect, I've had to have manuals under ISO 9000 that complied. This ain't it. This isn't even close to it. Is there some other document that we are unaware of that would reflect a manual? You can confer with your staff.
Mr. Chairman, the handbook was included in the OIG response on October 23rd.
We did not receive that response. October 23rd was pretty recent. Mr. Griffin, do you know something about this?
As I mentioned in your absence, Mr. Chairman, there's been a flurry of documents being sent to us as a result of the hearing, for which we are grateful.
So in other words, if we keep hauling them in, you'll get what you asked for?
I can't say that I have personal knowledge of receipt of the manual. I don't question the integrity of the answer given, but I haven't seen it myself.
Well, then, I hope you'll pledge to forward us a copy if you find it in that last-minute dump in anticipation of this hearing.
We'll do that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before I go to the ranking member, I do want to thank you for being here. Ms. Farrisee, I expect that we'll see you in the future because it is the intention, I just talked to the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, it's the intention of both of our committees to both continue looking at what is driving backlog down, if it starts really going down, and to continue to look about the question of the VA's drive to change the culture. And Mr. Griffin, I would suggest that you might keep us informed on whether the culture of timely delivery of your request are being met, because the idea that something arrives just before but not in time for you to review it for a full committee hearing, again, begs the question of whether you and Mr. Abe are being treated with the respect within your own department that we expect all IGs to be treated with. And with that, I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I take it, Ms. Farrisee, you can check with your staff. Can you let us know how long is the handbook? I mean, how many pages is it? About, I mean, just give me an approximation.
It's about 40 pages.
40 pages, I see. I just want to, first of all, Mr. Griffin, I want to thank you, Inspector Griffin, I want to thank you again and your staff. I got to tell you, Ms. Farrisee and Mr. Mayor, we can do better. And I think you would agree with that, don't you, Inspector General? You agree?
I do agree with that.
Yeah, we can do better. And I think that it would be legislative malpractice if we stood on this side of the dais and said, okay, everything is okay. It's not okay. And we're hoping that you will take that word back to your agency. And we realize that you probably got a lot of balls up in the air, but I got to tell you, well, first of all, as far as conferences is concerned, I can see that there's been you're not spending as much money. You seem like you've gotten pretty good control. It seems that way, but we'll see when you submit the documents that you'll be submitting. But we also are concerned about the backlog. And the chairman talks about, you know, this whole culture, what kind of culture we have there at Veterans. And we want to make sure that that culture is one that believes in efficiency and effectiveness, that believes in making sure that the taxpayers' dollars are spent in a prudent way, and make sure that money is spent to enhance the lives of our veterans. They've already given their blood, sweat, and tears, and so many, we have so many families who have lost a loved one. So, again, we see this as the urgency of now. I've got to tell you, when we were talking about the handbook, I didn't feel a sense of urgency, although I know we've gotten a draft. And then I asked a question about a document that was due October 1st, 2012. And it seemed as if, you know, we'll get to it when we can. Well, that's not good enough. And so, again, I'm hoping that you'll go back, that you'll address these issues with some sense of urgency. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank all participants today, and particularly our witnesses. And with that, we stand adjourned.